Hey guys, welcome back. My name's Nick. This week I turned an old table saw insert into a really cool knife. If you guys want to see how I did it, stick around. I had a few table saw inserts left over from an old table saw, and I figured, hey, you know what? Let's try and make something from this. I started by jotting out some lines and general measurements, and then just kind of hand sketched in the outline of what I wanted the knife to be. I kind of redefined it a couple times, but I kind of had a general idea of what I wanted to do. Then taking a rotary tool with a cutoff wheel, I just lightly etched in the contours of the metal. This gave me a starting point of some of the curves and how I wanted the knife to be shaped. I could then take deeper cuts to cut out the metal. Remember, with rotary tools, speed is key. You're not torquing down on the cutting wheel, you're just making light passes again and again. Once I was all the way through the cut, I was left with a general shape for the knife. I then could take it over to my 1-inch belt sander, remove most of the major burrs. That would make it a whole lot easier to work on without having to cut my hands. I then took it over to the grinder to establish somewhat of a bevel that I was going to sharpen later. As soon as the metal started to heat up, then I dunked it in water to cool it down, and I continued on the grinder. Once I had most of the bevel established, I could then go back to the belt sander and remove most of the paint from the table saw insert. This is what I was left with. Back at the table saw insert, I could then mark out a few circles and slots to accept the tang for both the blade guard and the pommel. I began by drilling a few starter holes and then elongated the slot with my jigsaw, just until the tang fit in the slot. Then using my jigsaw again, I could cut out some of these parts, bring it over to the belt sander, and refine the shape. You can notice from this shot that I actually had to cut the tang down quite a bit. I had to get the blade guard to slide over the tang. I didn't think this was going to be an issue having this initial hole here for the table saw insert that originally was for like a finger pull. I then could secure it into a vise and then use a map gas torch to get the metal nice and cherry hot. This is where I gambled a little bit. I tried to peen over the end, and I realized that the hole didn't leave enough material for me to do so. It kept bending over. So I lowered it into the vise and inserted a bolt so it didn't move much. I then could heat it back up and put the pommel back in place and start to hammer the tang so that it mushroomed around the pommel, securing it in place. The end warped on me a little bit, but not too bad. I could then continue to just hammer it home to make sure that the pommel was nice and secure. Once out of the vise, I just hammered it a little bit to straighten it all out. Using a scrap piece of pine, I didn't bother on changing my regular table saw blade, which is an alternating top bevel blade, so I had some grooves. Using a chisel, I cleaned it up a little bit and flattened the bottom of the groove. I cut the pieces in half, marked out a couple areas that were protruding a little bit, and then just cleaned that up with a chisel to make sure that the tang fit inside the wood. Once I had both sides of the handle fitting nicely, I marked to make sure I wasn't going to get the pieces confused. I also traced around the blade guard and the pommel to make sure that I didn't cut into those areas. A couple little reference lines to make sure at the bandsaw here I didn't cut into that groove. Now using some 2-part epoxy, I could smear that on one of the handle pieces and then also the tang, get one of the pieces nicely set, and then do the same thing with the other side and clamp it in place. Initially, I figured 3 clamps would be enough, but I couldn't get both surfaces to quite touch each other, so I figured I would add on an additional 3 clamps on the other side. This worked well and closed the gap nicely. Once all the epoxy had cured, I could then take it out of its clamps, I could bring it over to the bandsaw and fine-tune the shape a little bit. I wasn't necessarily going for finger grabs at this point, being I was going to wrap it in string later. To further smooth things out, I went back to the 1-inch belt sander and made everything nice and smooth and uniform. I even took a small utility knife to whittle away some of the parts. I wanted to wrap the handle in cotton string. The only problem is cotton string comes in natural color. I wanted it to be black. What I did was I made a small piece out of hardboard with a channel in it that fit into a small container I had that I could fill with India ink. Once I put the piece with the channel in it into the container, I could fill it with India ink and then run the string through it, coating the string in black ink. This worked out really well. I also coated the handle itself with some ebony stain. In case the string didn't cover the complete handle, I didn't want a high contrast behind it. Once I wiped off all the stain, I then began to wrap the handle. I started with the first layer with just tying a double knot in the first layer, then winding it nice and tight. The tail of the knot I included in the first few wraps or so to make sure that it was nice and secure. This didn't take all that long. I think I only had about maybe 15 or 20 minutes into doing it. I just kind of progressed. As I went, I made sure that all the string was nice and tight, and it was aligned, and it was nice and straight. A nice little tip is when you're on your last or maybe second to last wrap, you can insert a pencil, wrap it around again, and that'll create a nice little void where you can make a knot. Pull the string nice and tight, and then you're left with a nice tight joint for the string. I had maybe 3 or 4 millimeters left over, and that I just tucked underneath the last row. The handle didn't look too bad at all, but I figured there was a couple little spots here and there in the nooks and crannies that weren't quite jet black, so I applied a little bit more India ink and then moved it around with a foam brush, and the handle looked nice. At this point, I debated going with a full high polish versus just a wire wheel polish. The high polish won out. Then I made sure it was sanded to about 600 grit, and I brought it over to the polishing wheel. Here you can see the beginning of that polish. Nice camera in there, and, well, look at this handsome guy. Then I kind of cheated a little bit as far as the sharpening. I have this nice carbide kitchen sharpener, and that worked well. After about 40 or 50 passes, the knife was razor sharp. I then moved over to the blade, making sure to apply a liberal amount of paste wax, not only to the blade, but the handle itself. Then I came back with a heat gun and melted the wax so it seeped into all the little nooks and crannies all over the knife. From table saw insert to Bowie knife. And here you can see some zoomed in shots to give you guys a little bit more detail of the finished piece. To say that I'm happy with how it turned out would be a dramatic understatement. All the way from the beginning table saw insert to the finished knife, I could not have been happier. I mean, I was grinning ear to ear along the whole process. And that's really a good subtle reminder to myself of why I like to be out in my shop building and making things in the first place. Is it makes me happy. I could essentially take something that was garbage that I could have thrown away and turn it into a really nice finished piece. And I should note too, this is going to be a display piece. It's a gift for a friend of mine that is getting married, and he started a knife collection. I figured what better way than to start him off with his collection with something that's handmade by a friend of his. If you're going to be using it to chop down trees and hunt for alligators, well, then you're going to want to heat strengthen the blade and make sure that it'll maintain a sharp edge. I mean, this thing's sharp now, but if you were to actually use it, it wouldn't maintain that sharpness for very long. If this is your first time here, I encourage you to hit that subscribe button. And if you like this video, please share it on your social media. That helps out a lot. Or leave any types of comments or questions you might have down below. I always like hearing from you guys. Well, until I see you guys next time, take care. That's not a knife. Now that's a knife. Wallaby. And cut.